This is a reading of Written in Bone, Buried Lives in Jamestown by Sally Walker, Chapter 8, Part 3. The caption at the bottom of page 119 says, "The work at Harley Knoll continued. Measurements above left helped Doug Olsley determine that HK7 was a woman in her late teens. Her teeth above right were in very good condition." So the text starts, "A full day's work." Meanwhile, further information gleaned from the skull, pelvic bones, long bones, and teeth gave Olsley the information he needed to conclude that HK7 was a young woman, 18 or 19 years old when she died. He estimated her height at about 5 feet, or 1 5/10 meters. A green stain on the front of the cranium proved that her body had been shrouded. All of her teeth were in place and nicely spaced, except for her wisdom teeth. They never had formed at all. Some people don't develop wisdom teeth. Only 2 molars showed the first traces of developing cavities. Carrie Brewelhide theorized that the condition of the young woman's teeth may have been the result of the naturally high fluoride content in the area's water supply. Fluoride slows down the rate of tooth decay. As Olsley measured HK7's skeleton in situ, he looked for signs of what might have caused her death, but couldn't find anything obvious, nor did the laboratory examination reveal any signs of an ongoing disease that had persisted long enough to affect her bones. The cause of her death remains a mystery. The laboratory examination of both HK7 and HK9 did prove evidence. However, that both individuals labored very hard for much of their lives. As the lead coffin people of St. Mary City showed, everyone who lived in 17th and 18th century America worked from dusk until dawn. Heating houses, washing clothes, hunting for meat, growing crops, and even walking or boating from one place to another. All these required labor. HK9's humeri, or upper arm bones, had enlarged areas that provided he had used his arms for tasks that demanded strong upper arm muscles. While this bone evidence didn't specifically reveal what tasks HK9 performed, the historical record and archaeological discoveries have demonstrated that colonists routinely did several kinds of work that required significant upper body and arm strength. For example, early Maryland planters didn't have plows or other large farm implements. Land had to be cleared and prepared for planting entirely by hand. To solve this problem, the colonists copied the farming methods of Native Americans. Instead of cutting down and removing all the trees, they saved labor by removing only the small trunks, leaving larger ones still standing. Even this minimal preparation required wielding axe for hours. Even this minimal preparation required wielding an axe for hours on end. But that wasn't all. Next, workers had to drag away the trees they'd cut and split them into clapboards and timbers to build houses and other plantation buildings. Swinging a heavy, long-handled maul or hammer to pound a metal wedge into a tree trunk took plenty of muscle power. And that was the only way to split a tree trunk into rails for fences and logs for firewood. The labor didn't end there either. Planting and maintaining crops took enormous effort. The historical record notes that the plantation at Harley Knoll produced tobacco, which would have required the majority of the time and effort of the planters' workforce. Maryland law also required planters to grow enough corn to feed the people who lived on their land, about 2 acres or 8/10 hectares per person, per worker. Both crops were planted in small hills of soil, each about a foot or 3/10 meter high, which had to be hoed by hand. If moving dirt around doesn't sound that difficult, consider this. Together, the iron head and the wooden shaft of the average 17th century hilling hoe weighed about 4 pounds or 1 8/10 kilogram. And a single acre, 4/10 hectares of tobacco contained about 2,700 hills. An acre of corn, whose plants need more space, usually had about 1,200 hills. As the plants grew, weeds grew along with them and had to be chopped away. A different type of hoe was used for this task, and it weighed even more than a hilling hoe. When the crops were ready for harvesting, they had to be not only cut down, but also bundled and carried out of the fields. That's a lot of work. All right, let's look at page 120. The picture has a caption that says, "The work of slaves or servants at this time were mostly by hand. The researchers knew the bones would show exceptional muscle development if the buried people had been farm workers. The researchers compared the arm bones of HK9 above. The bone on the left is from his right arm, shows more robust development, suggesting he used his right arm more than his left." The 2 pictures on page 121 have a caption that says farm tools, which you see above, were simply made. The intensive labor to wield them, to cut down trees, to split the trees into logs, to plant and weed crops and to harvest them, meant the workers' days were long and hard. Below, the picture below. On page 122, we see a picture here, and the caption says, "A farm worker's back took continual abuse." HK9's spine, which you see on the left, shows signs of a disease called DISH, which appears mostly in older men. Several of his vertebrae slowly fused together, which you see in the inset, making it hard for him to move. All right, let's see. Labor of this kind, repeated over a period of years, is hard on the body. As Brewelheid had noticed during the excavation, HK9's vertebrae displayed lipping, indicating that he suffered from spinal arthritis. This kind of arthritis is often related to wear and tear and is consistent with a lifetime of repetitive labor. The backbone also showed signs of a condition called diffuse idiopathic skeletal hypostosis, or DISH. DISH is more common in men than women and it usually occurs in people over 50 years old. DISH is found in people whose lives were characterized by strenuous physical activity, explained Osley. Doctors are uncertain what causes it, but its effects are clear. DISH makes the tendons and ligaments along the spine harden. The bone along the sides of the vertebrae grow excessively, so much that the vertebrae often fuse together, causing loss of mobility of the spine. The bone growth may be so severe that the bone comes to resemble a partially burned candle with hardened drops of wax along its length. 9 of H.K. 9's vertebrae were fused in this manner, in three separate sections. Brule Hyde noticed that even more vertebrae had been fused together, but they had broken apart some time after the burial. As a person afflicted with dish, HK9 had a stiff back. At times he experienced pain, particularly in the morning before he had a chance to move and stretch his muscles. As Brule Hyde and Owsley examined HK9's skeleton, other archaeologists tracked down information about the button found among the man's remains. Made of brass, the button was 6/10 inches or 1 5/10 centimeters wide. By comparing it with other buttons whose manufacture dates were known, the archaeologists were able to determine that HK9's button was made between 1726 and 1776. Thus, he could not have died before 1726, and most likely he died sometime during his 50-year period. This 50-year period. Because HK7 was buried near the old man at about the same depth and aligned in the same direction, the people who dug the second grave must have known and remembered the location and alignment of the first. HK9 and HK7 therefore died within a few years of each other. Hence, the button may shed some light on the circumstances of HK7's life. The historical record indicates that during the period in which the button had been made, the people who owned the knoll had also owned slaves. Also during that period, the majority of Africans and African Americans in Maryland were slaves. So it seems likely, although not certain, that HK7 and the other people of African heritage buried at Harley Knoll were slaves. And if HK9 was African as well, it is likely that he was a slave. What kind of work might HK7 have been required to do as a slave? When Owsley and Brule Hyde examined her arm bones in the laboratory, they noticed muscle attachment sites that indicated she frequently flexed and extended her elbows. During the mid-18th century in Maryland, the majority of enslaved women had worked in the fields, just like men. Thus, HK7 probably hoed tobacco, inspected the leaves of the growing plants for pests such as hornworms and cutworms, and removed poor quality leaves near the base of the plant to allow the upper leaves to grow larger. If she hadn't worked in the fields, grinding corn may have been one of her chores. After corn was harvested, dried, and removed from the cob, it had to be ground into meal so that it could be used to make bread and mush. Unless there was a nearby mill where the planter could take the dried kernels to be ground by machine, this step had to be done by hand with mortar and pestle. This tiring task topped the list of household drudgery. It required raising and dropping an iron pestle, which weighed as much as 5 pounds, or 2 3/10 kilogram, many thousands of times to crush the corn into minuscule pieces. Preparing wool to make cloth also requires flexing and extending the elbow. During the 1600s, all cloth in Chesapeake colonies was imported from Europe. But by the mid 1700s, some planters in the region had begun producing cloth. If the planter who owned the Knoll property had been among them, HK7's work might have included a process called carding. A clump of wool is placed on a paddle with rows of narrowly spaced wire teeth on it. A second similarly toothed paddle is pressed into the wool and pulled it through. The teeth of the two paddles align the wool fibers, so that they could be spun together into yarn on a spinning wheel. These actions must be repeated several times for each clump of wool. Any of these jobs, along with less complex ones such as hauling buckets of water from a well and doing laundry, would have caused HK7 to develop strong arm muscles. While her bones clearly indicate that she used her arms for strenuous physical activity, it is impossible to conclude exactly which tasks she did, only that they were numerous and that she had done them since she was a little girl. To add to the slow-growing portrait of the lives at Harley Knoll people, the team sent samples from the remains for carbon-13 analysis. HK9, the old man, had carbon-13 value of 13.8. HK7's carbon value was, negative 11.1, and HK9 was negative 13 and 8/10. Both values are consistent with those of a person who had eaten a corn-based diet for a long period of time. Remember, in English, carbon value is negative 21 to negative 18. No one knows if either HK7 or HK9 was born in Maryland. The question of their birthplaces joined several other unknowns about the people of Harley Knoll. We can't be certain whether HK7 and HK9 were slaves, indentured servants, or free persons, or exactly what types of work they did. We may never learn how they died, whether they were related, or even if they knew each other. But we do know that they were well regarded by family or friends. Unlike the boy at Levy Neck, both were buried with care and respect when their lives of intense labor ended. On page 124, you'll notice a picture, and the caption says, "Archaeologists were just as interested in the life of HK7. Her arm bones told them that she worked both arms a great deal. If she worked close to home, she might have used a mortar and pestle to grind corn above, as she might have combined wool fibers to clean and straighten them for spinning into yarn, facing page, as demonstrated by the reenactors."